Hello everyone and welcome. Today we bring you an epic science fiction story from the HFY universe. The air in Port Anarchy was always thick with the scent of ozone, exotic spices, and desperation. But today it was thick with a tension more primal than greed. The crowd, a chaotic mix of a dozen species, had formed a rough circle in the main merchant square. They weren't here for a deal. They were here for a death. At one end of the circle stood Prince Kalen of the Vexxians. He wasn't wearing his royal silks, but something far more valuable, his pearlescent combat armor, which was being given its final adjustments by two attendants. The suit gleamed under the station's artificial lights, a monument to advanced technology and immense wealth. At the foot of his gleaming private shuttle was a dark red smear and clumps of golden fur, staining the Durasteel deck. It was all that was left of Buddy. Caleb stood opposite him. The human was a stark contrast to the prince. His clothes were simple, worn but clean, a plain gray shirt and dark cargo pants. He stood perfectly still, one hand gripping the hilt of the Ōdachi that rested point down on the ground before him. The sword was enormous, a single long curve of dark, non-reflective metal that seemed completely out of place in the high-tech station. His face was stone, his jaw set. There was no rage in his eyes. There was something far colder, something that looked terrifyingly like emptiness. It was the face of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. Across the impromptu arena, a different kind of observer watched, his gaze missing nothing. Jorik the analyst stood half hidden by a stack of cargo containers. He wasn't here for the spectacle, he was here for the data. He murmured quietly into the high-frequency comm unit embedded in his collar, his voice a low, analytical monotone. Log entry, subject Terran American male. Physical condition appears excellent. Posture suggests formal combat training, likely military. Weapon, Japanese-style longsword, an Ōdachi. Appears to be a training model. No visible edge, solid steel construction. An unusual choice. Catalyst for conflict. Subject's canine companion was terminated by the Vexxian Prince's landing craft. He paused, his eyes flicking from Caleb's stoic form to the prince's shimmering armor. The Vexxian hails from a 0.8 standard gravity world. Their bodies are tall and gracile, evolved for elegance, not raw power. Their strength comes from technology, not biology. The armor compensates, of course. It enhances strength, speed, and provides full-spectrum shielding. Jorik leaned forward slightly, his professional curiosity piqued. This was more than just another station brawl. This was an equation. The Terran, the data is clear, but often overlooked. He is adapted to a 2.5 standard gravity environment, a fundamental physical disparity of immense scale. His muscular and skeletal density are far beyond galactic norms. He fell silent for a moment, watching as the Vexxian attendants locked the final armor plate into place with a hiss of pneumatics. The prince stood tall, a god of modern warfare facing a man with an ancient, impractical weapon. The question remains, Jorik concluded his log entry, his voice barely a whisper. Can technology compensate for the brutal truth of physics? On the Vexxian side of the circle, the preparations were a display of cold, military precision. The two attendants moved with the irreverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. One of them polished the prince's helmet, its featureless visor staring back like the face of an insect god. The other ran a final diagnostic on the power gauntlets, which hummed with contained energy. There was no boasting, no laughter. There was only the quiet, chilling confidence of absolute superiority. The targeting system is locked on the creature's heart, one attendant reported, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It will track every beat until you command it to stop. Prince Kalen flexed his armored fingers, the servos in the joints whispering almost silently. He didn't even glance at Caleb. His attention was on the reflection of his own magnificent form in the shuttle's polished hull. It has a heart, then? The prince asked, a flicker of amusement in his tone. I wasn't sure. A formality, my prince, the attendant said. The suit's auto-targeter could find a weakness in a comet. A soft-bodied primitive offers no challenge. The only question is how little power you wish to expend. See that you do, Kalen commanded. I want this farce over. The stench of poverty offends the air. Across the square, Caleb was engaged in a different kind of preparation. He ignored the Vexxians, ignored the murmuring crowd, and ignored the imposing figure of his opponent. He knelt, He knelt on the hard, cold deck, next to the tragic smear that had been his only friend. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a weapon, not a piece of technology, but a simple, worn dog tag on a beaded chain. It was dull from years of wear, the embossed letters smooth to the touch. He held it in his palm, his thumb tracing the familiar indentations. It was his own, from a lifetime ago. He had given the other one to Sarah. His eyes closed for a single pained moment. The roar of the station faded away, replaced by a silence filled with ghosts. He could almost feel the warmth of a small, furry body leaning against his leg. He could almost hear a familiar, happy bark. It was the last echo of a life he had lost, a bridge to a past that now felt like another man's story. His internal voice was not a shout of rage, but a cold, hard whisper against the walls of his own skull. I wasn't there for you, Sarah. I couldn't protect this little guy either. There won't be a third time. He let out a long, slow breath, a technique that had been drilled into him at Paris Island and later refined in the quiet solitude of a kendo dojo he'd found on a remote orbital. It was a fusion of two worlds, the unyielding discipline of a marine and the focused stillness of a swordsman. He was emptying his mind of grief, of fear, of everything but the task at hand. The pain wasn't gone. It was being forged into a tool, something sharp and hard and useful. When he opened his eyes again, the emptiness was gone, replaced by a focus as pure and absolute as a vacuum. He stood up in one fluid motion, the dog tag disappearing back into his pocket. His grip on the Ōdachi was firm, but not tight. He began to walk. The crowd instinctively parted before him. The only sound was the rhythmic, metallic scrape of the massive sword's tip being dragged across the durasteel deck. Scrap, scrap, scrap. Each sound was a deliberate footstep, a slow, marching beat counting down to the inevitable. It was the sound of something heavy and final approaching. He stopped in the center of the makeshift arena, a dozen meters from the prince. He did not raise his sword. He simply stood there, a mountain of quiet resolve. Prince Kalen watched him, his head tilted in a gesture of contemptuous curiosity. The Vexxian lord's voice, amplified by his helmet's external speakers, boomed across the square. Have you come to beg, human? Your posture suggests you are about to fall to your knees. A wise decision. Caleb's eyes met the prince's blank visor. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried with an unnerving clarity in the sudden silence. This sword isn't for cutting. The statement hung in the air, simple, direct, and utterly baffling. To the Vexxians, it sounded like an admission of weakness. To Yorick the analyst, it sounded like a declaration of intent. Prince Kalen did not wait for a signal. He attacked. The movement was a blur of pearlescent armor, a surge of speed that should have been impossible for a being of his size. The powered servos in the suit's legs launched him forward, closing the distance in a heartbeat. His fist, wreathed in a crackling blue energy field, descended like a meteor, or aimed to turn Caleb's head into a red mist. But Caleb wasn't there. He hadn't made a desperate leap or a frantic scramble. He had taken a single, precise step to the left, his body rotating around his lead foot. The Ōdachi, still held in a low grip, swung with him, its immense weight acting as a perfect counterbalance to his motion. The prince's energy-charged fist smashed into the deck, sending a shower of sparks and molten metal into the air, leaving a smoking crater where Caleb had stood a second before. Stand still and die with dignity, vermin! Kalen roared, his amplified voice echoing across the square. He pivoted, his suit's joints hissing, and launched another attack, a sweeping kick designed to cut a man in half. Again, Caleb moved. It was not a retreat, but a fluid evasion. He flowed backward, just outside the kick's lethal arc. The movements were economical, almost minimalist. They were the practiced motions of a man who had spent thousands of hours learning the most efficient way to move his body, a blend of a marine's sharp, angular footwork and the circular, flowing grace of the sword art he had adopted. To the untrained eye in the crowd, it looked like the human was being hopelessly outmatched, a mouse avoiding the stomps of a giant. But Yorick, the analyst, saw the truth. He spoke into his comm unit, his voice tight with professional fascination. He's not running. He's not even just dodging. He's drawing a map. Kalen attacked again and again. A flurry of blows, each one powerful enough to punch through a starship's hull. A high-speed lunge. A spinning back fist. He was a whirlwind of technological fury. And with every attack, Caleb simply wasn't there. He moved with the calm inevitability of a tide, letting the prince's rage wash past him. He never tried to block. He never tried to parry. The Ōdachi remained an extension of his body, a heavy, silent partner in his dance of evasion. His eyes, however, were not calm. They were hard, analytical, and constantly in motion. They weren't watching the prince's fists, they were watching the joints of the armor. The pistons in the elbows, the actuators in the hips, the servos in the ankles. He was observing the machine's rhythm. He was noting the fractional delay between the prince's intent and the suit's execution. He was learning its weaknesses. Incredible, Yorick whispered. He's timing the servo lags. He is building a complete schematic of the suit's performance limitations in his mind. He's mapping it. After another near miss, Caleb stumbled. It was a small thing, a slight catch of his boot on an uneven deck plate, but it looked like his first major mistake. He seemed to lose his footing for a split second, his body lurching awkwardly to the side. For Prince Kalen, who was growing increasingly frustrated by this impossible dance, it was the opening he had been waiting for. A surge of triumphant rage flooded his senses. He lunged, abandoning all finesse for a straight, overpowering thrust, channeling all the suit's power into his left leg to propel him forward for the final crushing blow. He was aiming for the exact spot where Caleb would land after his stumble. But the stumble was a lie. Caleb's lurch was a perfectly controlled drop in elevation. He had seen the warped, slightly raised edge of the deck plate minutes ago. He had been waiting for the right moment to use it. He had guided the prince, attack by attack, to the specific spot in the arena. As Kalen lunged, committing his full weight and momentum, Caleb's stumble flowed into a low, coiled stance. The prince's foot, instead of finding solid ground, landed directly on the raised edge of the plate, throwing his ankle off by a single critical degree. In that instant of instability, Caleb struck. He didn't swing the Ōdachi's length. He didn't try to use its non-existent edge. He exploded upward from his crouch, rotating his hips and shoulders, and drove the heavy steel pommel at the end of the sword's hilt, the kashira, directly into the side of the prince's armored knee joint. There was no clang of metal on metal. There was a sickening, dry crunch. It was the sound of advanced alloys and microservos being destroyed by kinetic force and superior leverage. Sparks flew from the joint. The Vexxian Prince let out a shocked cry as the diagnostic warnings flashed red across his internal display. The armor in his left leg was still functional, but the main knee servo was shattered. It could no longer bend properly. It moved with a stiff, dragging motion. The invincible suit was no longer perfect. And for the first time, a flicker of something that looked like fear appeared in the Vexxian Prince's posture. The dynamic of the fight shifted instantly. The hunter had become the hunted. Caleb did not give the prince a moment to recover. He closed the distance, stepping inside the effective range of the Vexxian's remaining good arm. Kalen swung his energy fist in a wide, panicked arc, but Caleb was already too close. He used the flat of the Ōdachi's blade not to block, but to deflect. He met the armored arm and used the sword's immense mass to push the blow wide, sending the prince stumbling from his own momentum. Before Kalen could regain his footing, Caleb was on him. He wasn't trying to land a killing blow. He was taking the machine apart. He slammed the hilt of his sword upward, catching the prince under the armored elbow, forcing the arm into an unnatural angle with a groan of protesting metal. He used the long blade as a lever, hooking it behind Kalen's functional knee and pulling, forcing the Vexxian lord into a clumsy, staggering retreat. The Ōdachi was no longer a sword. It was a crowbar, a staff, a battering ram. "You dare touch me?" Kalen shrieked, his voice cracking with disbelief and fury. He swatted wildly, his movements now clumsy and predictable. Caleb ignored the words. He saw only targets. He spun, using his body's full rotation to swing the flat of the blade directly into the side of the prince's helmet. The impact produced a loud, jarring clang, and the helmet's external sensor arrays shattered into a spiderweb of broken optics. Another swing, and the heavy pommel slammed into the helmet's visor. It didn't break through, but a network of opaque cracks instantly spread across the Vexxian's field of vision. The crowd gasped. The fight had transformed. This was no longer a duel, it was a methodical, brutal disassembly. Caleb's skills were not flashy. There were no elegant spins or dramatic poses. Every movement was ruthlessly efficient, designed to break, cripple, and unmake his enemy's technological advantage. Blinded, crippled, and overwhelmed with a rage that eclipsed all reason, Prince Kalen did the only thing he had left. He committed to one final desperate charge. Lowering his head like a beast, he activated every remaining thruster and servo, launching his entire body forward as a 2-ton projectile of armor and hate. This time, Caleb didn't move. He stopped his dance. He planted his feet on the Durasteel deck, sinking his weight down, his boots grinding against the metal as if he were taking root. For the first time in the fight, he brought the Ōdachi back, gripping the long hilt with both hands. He wasn't just standing his ground, he was becoming an anchor, a fixed point in the chaos. And in that moment of stillness, he called upon the strength he rarely used. It was the legacy of his homeworld, a power forged in the crushing 2.5G environment of Earth. It was in the dense, coiled muscle of his legs, the thick cords of his back and shoulders, the powerful grip of his hands. As the charging prince filled his vision, Caleb unleashed it all. He rotated his hips, his shoulders, his entire body, channeling every ounce of his strength into a single horizontal swing. It was not the swing of a swordsman. It was the swing of a demolition worker felling a building. The Ōdachi moved in a perfect, unstoppable arc, a blur of dark metal carrying an almost unbelievable amount of kinetic energy. The sword connected with the center of Prince Kalen's chestplate. The sound was not a sharp clang or a metallic ring. It was a dull, deep, final thud. It was the sound of a wrecking ball hitting concrete. The advanced alloy of the chest piece, designed to deflect energy blasts and piercing rounds, buckled inward like tinfoil. The force of the impact didn't send the prince flying backward. It collapsed him. The sound of cracking metal was instantly followed by the wet, sickening crunch of ribs and sternum shattering. All the kinetic energy was transferred directly into the prince's body. For a single horrifying moment, his armored form seemed to compress in on itself. Then he simply dropped. He fell to the deck like a puppet with its strings cut, landing in a heap of twisted, silent metal. The hum of the power armor died. The crackle of the energy fields vanished. In the center of the arena, the prince's magnificent suit of armor, his symbol of power and superiority, had become nothing more than a high-tech coffin, crushing the very man it was designed to protect. For a long moment, absolute silence reigned over the merchant square. The buzz of the crowd, the hum of the station's life support, everything seemed to have been swallowed by the final, brutal thud of the impact. The only sound was the ragged gasps of Caleb's own breathing, each exhale creating a small white cloud in the air. He stood over the fallen prince, the Ōdachi's tip resting on the deck, his chest rising and falling. Then the silence was broken. One of the Vexxian attendants, his face a mask of horror and disbelief, finally found his voice. You will pay for this!" he stammered, pointing a trembling white finger at Caleb. "The Vexxian royal fleet will burn this station to ashes. You have murdered royalty." Caleb slowly raised his head. He looked past the wrecked armor and at the two attendants, his eyes as cold and empty as deep space. When he spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of the passion and pain that had fueled him. There was nothing left but a chilling finality. "Honor isn't the armor you wear," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the attendants' pathetic threats. "It's what you're willing to protect. Your prince died for his pride." He paused, his gaze flicking to the red smear on the deck near the shuttle. "I fought for a good friend. Now get out of my sight." He turned his back on them, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. The remaining Vexxians, faced with the cold indifference of the man who had just dismantled their god prince, scrambled to retrieve the body, their earlier arrogance replaced by a frantic, fearful haste. As the Vexxians fled, another figure stepped out from the shadows of the cargo containers. It was Yorick, the analyst. He deactivated his recording device and walked calmly toward Caleb, his eyes not on the human but on the crumpled suit of armor. He stopped a few feet away, his professional gaze assessing the damage with an almost academic interest. "That was a methodical disassembly," Yorick said, his voice calm and even. "Not a fight." He looked up, meeting Caleb's tired eyes. There was no pity in his expression, only a profound professional respect. The universe is full of equations. Most beings only see the simple ones. You understand the underlying variables. Yorick reached into his coat, produced a thin black credit chip, and placed it on a nearby crate. "Information," he said simply. "My network is extensive. If you ever find yourself needing to know anything in this galaxy, the location of a person, the weakness in a system, the truth behind a lie, that chip will find me. Caleb didn't even glance at the chip. He didn't acknowledge the analyst's offer. His war was over. His duty was done. He slowly pulled the Ōdachi's tip from the deck, the scraping sound loud in the quiet square. He rested the heavy sword on his shoulder and walked away, not toward the station's exit, but back toward the spot where his journey had begun. He stopped for a moment, looking down at the place where Buddy had spent his last moments. No one could see his face, but every person in the crowd could feel the immense weight of his loss. Then, without another word, he turned and walked on, disappearing into the anonymous crowds of Port Anarchy. Yorick watched him go, then picked up the chip and slid it back into his pocket. He turned back to the scene of the duel, his mind already composing the final lines of his report. Conclusion: technological superiority can be negated by a fundamental physical disparity and superior tactical discipline. The true strength of a Terran lies not in their technology, but in the very gravity that shaped them. He paused, adding one last crucial thought. Addendum: never corner a Marine, and whatever you do, don't ever touch his dog.